4-week series. And for several weeks, we've been thinking about the power of words. That feels a little hot to me. I feel a little hot. Yeah. Thank you, James. For many of you, the direction of your life really has been determined by words that have been spoken to you or spoken over you or spoken about you. I mean, who you see when you look in the mirror has been largely dictated to you by words from other people. And just as words have shaped the direction of your life, your words now have the potential and are shaping the direction of other lives. So the theme of this series has been a very simple idea. Because words are so powerful, and because once they're out there, right, we can't pull them back, we should all be what? Quick, slow to speak. That's wrong. Yeah, we should be quick to listen, slow to speak. We're going to come back to that in a second because that was dreadful. That was slow pastor moment right there. But this really is, if we're able to do this, a game changer in relationships. This is a game changer in family. Everybody wins when everybody does this. So because this is going to be our last chance to say this together, and just a second ago was awful, let's everybody recite this together one more time with passion. We should all be quick to listen, slow to speak. Quick to listen, slow to speak. Okay. So we talked last week about the positive side of this and using our words to build people up. Learning to see every conversation as a construction site and our words as the building materials. And as the Apostle Paul, as we looked at his words last week, as he pointed out, you can't be a builder if you're bitter. He said you can't be a builder if you're bitter. If you're someone that just harbors and carries around bitterness and anger from your past, that bitterness will seep out into your words. It will seep out into what you say, and it will seep out into what you refuse to say. So dealing with our bitterness is a big, big deal. This morning, we're gonna kind of take that idea to the extreme, because every once in a while, something strange happens in our world. Every once in a while, the saying is, what goes around comes around. Every once in a while, the powerless find themselves in a position of power. So the people that hurt you, it turns out, may someday need you. The people that hurt you may someday need you. And the way you leverage your words in that moment says a ton about the kind of person you are. Some of you really, when you look at your history and the people that have wounded you, you could never imagine the script being flipped. But you may be surprised what happens as your life goes on. Life has this way of catching up, doesn't it? It has this way of turning. And sometimes what goes around, comes around. Now, others of you you're like right in the midst of this morning. I've had some conversations with some of you about aging parents and that kind of thing. And back in the day, your mom or your dad, they were supposed to protect you and love you and help you. But they wounded you. And now they're elderly. And now their health is failing. And now their mind is going. And they need you. Or maybe a brother or a sister was so unkind to you. Maybe they were bigger and they were older and they used that and they leveraged it to wound you and hurt you. But now, suddenly, they're in a position where they need you. Their life has gone sideways, or they're having a crisis, or their health is failing, or they're in a financial mess, and they need you. Okay, what goes around comes around. Or it might be an old friend or an old business partner, but someone from your past that's hurt you needs you. For some of you, this really isn't like a futuristic hypothetical at all. In your life right now, this is staring you in the face. And so what you do with your power now says so much about the kind of person that you are. Now, so far in this series, for the first 3 weeks, we've been looking at New Testament letters, right? The first 2 weeks, we read a letter from James, right? The little brother of Jesus, which is so cool. And then last week, we looked at a letter written by the Apostle Paul. Today, we're going to look, like totally shifting gears, we're going to look at a fantastic story from the Old Testament. This story spans 13 chapters. And so for the sake of time, and I think you'll appreciate this, I am going to need to summarize much of it. And I also want to say that throughout this series, I've leaned heavily on some of the teaching and the work of Andy Stanley. He's just a fantastic, somebody that I follow and get a lot from. And so I've been leaning on his teaching and his material throughout this series. This morning's story and insights into it and the way it flows, really, I've been helped a ton by Andy Stanley as well. So this Old Testament story centers around a guy named Joseph. If you're not familiar with the Bible, let me clear this up. You don't know what the Old Testament is, so let me just tell you that this is not Joseph as in Joseph and Mary Joseph. That would be confusing for you. This is a Joseph that lived a way long time before him. And many of you know that Joseph, Old Testament Joseph, had a famous dad. His dad was named Jacob. And God eventually renamed Jacob Israel, okay, which means wrestles with God. And Jacob went on and had 12 sons, and the 12 sons eventually became the 12 tribes of what? Of Israel. Okay, so Joseph was number 11 of the 12. He had 10 older brothers and 1 younger. And the thing about Joseph was that he was his father Jacob's favorite son because he was the son of his father Jacob's favorite wife. So Jacob, different time, different culture. He had 2 wives, and then he had a couple of other ladies that bore him some children. And so I just want to say right here, some of you are big on like application. We need application from the sermon. So let me get straight to some application. Men, I'm only speaking to men. Men, never have a favorite wife. It will cause problems. And for Jacob, it caused a lot of problems because he had a favorite wife named Rachel who had Joseph. And then Rachel went on and gave birth to another little boy named Benjamin. But Rachel died in childbirth. And so Jacob was constantly mourning the loss of his favorite wife. And in the process of all of that grief, Joseph became by far and away his favorite son. So Joseph had 10 older brothers who naturally resented and despised him. They knew that their father loved him more than them. He was spoiled. He was given everything. They had to shop at Walmart. He shopped at Nordstrom's. It was bad. Okay. Their little league games, Dad was never around, but Jacob was coaching Joseph's team. So then one day, Joseph had kind of a weird dream. So he gathers his brothers, and he said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." He's like, "Do you guys see? In my dream, we all had sheaves, but I had the biggest sheaf of all. And your sheaves bowed down to my sheaf, and this means that one day I will rule over you. Isn't that cool? Aren't you guys so happy for me?" And it turns out they were not all that happy. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? These are his older brothers. Will you actually rule us?" And it says, and they hated him all the more. They already hated him. They hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Now, you'd think that Joseph might be somewhat astute and pick up on what's happening with his brothers and just sort of stop there, but he doesn't. And not only does he have weird prophetic dreams, he has this habit of always telling the brutal truth, even if it upsets people. So the text goes on and says, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Like, really? You know, I don't know. I'm thinking, Joseph, you know, you think you could keep that to yourself? But somehow he's somebody who tells the truth regardless of the consequences. He's not afraid to ruffle feathers, as we're going to see as the story goes on. So one day, Jacob tells Joseph, hey, I want you to go out and check up on your brothers, which was probably his favorite thing, to go and find out whatever they might be doing wrong and come back and tell Dad. So they're out working, and Joseph is sent out to check on them and report. Now, question, why isn't Joseph out working with his brothers? Well, I think they're probably wondering the same thing. And so he comes riding in, hey guys, comes riding in, and they see him coming, and as he's off in the distance, they think, you know what, we've had enough of this. We've had enough of you. This is ridiculous. And so they take Joseph, and they throw him in a big pit. Then after they throw him in, they huddle up together, and they decide, let's kill him. Now, some of you came from some sibling rivalry. This takes it to another level. So they say, let's kill him, but first, let's have lunch. We're hungry. And so the text says, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Meanwhile, Joseph's in the pit, right? He's going, hey guys, real funny. Ha ha ha. Like, come get me out, right? But they see this caravan of foreigners coming through. And so, check this out. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up its blood? Guys, there's like no profit. We don't get anything out of just killing him. So he says, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother. And all 10 were like, he is our brother. So they pull him out of the pit, and he has to be terrified. And he doesn't know what's going to happen. And he sees this caravan of strangers speaking foreign languages, and his brothers tie him up. They bind up his hands and his feet, and they sell their own brother to these slave traders. Now, at this point in the story, Joseph is 17 years old, and he has no idea what's going to happen. He doesn't know who he's going to end up as a slave to. He doesn't know what he's going to be purchased to be doing. And so he's heading off with the Ishmaelites, and his brothers are like, see ya. Have a good life, little brother. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, okay, a bigwig, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And then comes maybe like the strangest part of the story. In fact, it's a theme that just kind of gets repeated again and again through the story. In the midst of all this chaos, we're told, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. The Lord was with Joseph. I think that's a little weird because we think, no. If the Lord was with Joseph, Joseph would be at home with his father, and his 10 wicked brothers would be the ones serving as slaves in Egypt. Because Joseph hasn't done anything wrong here except for being kind of socially dumb. And yet the wicked brothers are getting away with something horrible. I mean, if God is with someone, don't good things happen? And yet throughout this story, this is the theme again and again, over and over. And what's more surprising, I think, and kind of the takeaway for us, is that through this entire ordeal, Joseph chose to live as a man that God was with. Joseph decided to live his life as if God was with him, rather than God having abandoned him. Well, before long, Potiphar notices that Joseph is like really skilled. He's talented. And he keeps giving him more and more and more responsibility over the years that he's serving as a slave. And after a few years, Joseph ends up managing Potiphar's entire household. Big household, rich guy, powerful guy in Egypt. Now, Potiphar wasn't the only guy, if you know the story, that noticed Joseph. Potiphar's wife also noticed Joseph. So Potiphar's wife comes to him and says to him, "Slave, I require your services. So come to bed with me." Now, this isn't really an invitation. It's a command. Because she's like, "I own you, slave. Now do what I say and sleep with me." And for the first time, maybe in her whole life, this powerful, wealthy woman gets told no. And this is weird because in ancient cultures where there were slaves, slaves don't say no. Slaves don't say anything at all. Slaves just obey and they do what they're told. But this Hebrew slave has the audacity to say to his master's wife, "No, I refuse to do what you are requiring me to do." He says, "No one is greater in this house than I am. Like, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife." He's like, "How in the world could I possibly betray my master like that?" And that's enough reason to say no. But what he says next is really shocking. He says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Which is kind of weird. Because we think, wait a minute, God? Like, you mean the God who's done nothing for you? The God who watched as you were sold by your brothers into who knows what? You mean the God who stood by and did nothing to intercede or rescue you? Why would you even care about trying to be faithful to that kind of God? And she continues to try to seduce him and try to command him day after day, demanding his services. And he keeps saying, "No, no, 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 I'm not going to do it." Finally, she's had enough, and she gets vindictive. And she's ready to punish this rebellious slave. And so she accuses Joseph of raping her. When Potiphar finds out, Joseph's life obviously takes another sudden turn. It says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And then again, the author brings us back to this theme that rotates through the story. But while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him. To which we're like, no, stop it. That's not how it works. If the Lord is with you, you don't end up in prison. She goes to prison. This whole turn in the story isn't working. Good things are supposed to happen to good people, and bad things are supposed to happen to bad people. If you're faithful, it's all supposed to work out. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Who wants to have favor in the eyes of the prison warden? Is that your life goal? I don't know about you. I don't want to know the prison warden. I don't want to need the prison warden to do anything for me. If God is with you, you're not supposed to need the prison warden. And here we're reminded of something that we need to be aware of every day. Bad things have been happening to good people for a long time. And so what we see again and again in scriptures is that God has been with good people in bad times for a long time. So Joseph eventually becomes the director of operations for the prison. He gets elevated to a status that is unprecedented for a prisoner. The warden sees all of this talent in Joseph for administration, and he gives him like unreal power and authority inside the prison. But even so, Joseph is still desperate to get out. So one day, after many years now in the prison, Pharaoh's butler and Pharaoh's baker fall out of favor with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh has those two guys thrown into the same prison where, of course, they meet Joseph. And so one day, Joseph notices that they are unusually depressed. Now, it's normal for people in prison in a dungeon in Egypt to be depressed, but they were especially depressed. And so Joseph says, hey, you guys aren't yourselves today. Something's wrong. What's up? And so they tell him, well, we both had dreams, and they were incredibly vivid and real, and they really feel like they mean something, but we have no idea if what they mean is good or bad. We don't know what these dreams mean. And so Joseph says, well, if you want, you can tell me your dreams, because I've had some pretty vivid dreams myself over the years, and so who knows, maybe I can help you with this, okay? So they tell Joseph their dreams. First, the butler. He tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph says, I've got good news. Here's what the dream means. In 3 days, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and on that day, he's going to lift up your head and restore you as his personal butler and wine taster. And then Joseph adds on, let me just kick this in there. He's like, but when you're free, please tell him about me. I was sold unjustly into slavery, and then I was accused of a crime that I didn't commit by a horrendous woman. I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be in this dungeon, but I need somebody on the outside with a little bit of leverage to advocate for me. So when you get out, remember me. And the butler's like, man, if you're right, and in 3 days I get out and get restored to my old life, I will absolutely remember you. Well, the baker, he's been listening to all this. And he's like, wow, that was pretty good news. Hey, how about me? How about my dream? So he tells his dream to Joseph, and Joseph pauses, and he says, well, in 3 days, your head's going to be lifted up too, off of your body, unfortunately, and then your body's going to be impaled on a stake, and the birds are going to come and feast on your flesh. Now, why he had to go into all that detail? I mean, my goodness, the poor baker, right? If you're Joseph, don't you just kind of go, you listen to the dream, you go, huh, that's tricky. Yeah, right? Like, kind of murky, not really seeing very clearly what's going on with that one, so we'll just have to wait and see, right? Joseph is brutal. And sure enough, 3 days later, the baker is beheaded and impaled, and the butler is restored. And so you put yourself in Joseph's place. A day goes by, a week goes by, a year goes by, and nothing happens. His situation does not change at all. And we're told in the story, the butler forgot all about Joseph. And for some of you, that's like, that's your life story right now. Like, you feel forgotten. You just feel forgotten. And for Joseph, a year goes by, another year, and for all he knows, this is going to be his entire life. He's going to die someday in this prison. But day after day, he continues to live as if God is with him. Now Joseph is 30 years old, and Pharaoh has some vivid dreams. And he's deeply disturbed by these dreams. He's convinced that they mean something significant. So he calls in all of the court magicians, right, and all of the counselors, and he calls in all the wise men in Egypt, and no one can interpret his dreams. And then the butler remembers. And he says to Pharaoh, hey, listen, remember a few years ago when we had that like little tiny misunderstanding and you put me in the dungeon? I barely remember it myself. Really, it was no big deal. But in prison, I met a Hebrew slave that can interpret dreams. It was crazy. Like I had a dream, and the baker, you probably don't remember him, but we both had dreams, and he interpreted the dreams, and sure enough, exactly what he said would happen, happened. So I think, if you're interested, maybe he could help you. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. One he had shaved because, okay, been in there a long time. He was a mangled mess. And changed his clothes because he smelled like dungeon. He came before Pharaoh. Okay, so now imagine this moment. He's standing before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Now, what Joseph says next is shocking and foolish. Joseph says, I cannot do it. And the butler is like, what? Hi-ho, it's back to the dungeon I go. What are you doing, man? Like, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, okay, who thinks he's a god, who every day of his life is reminded, you are a god. He replies to Pharaoh, he says, but God, okay, my God, the God of the Hebrew people that you don't even know anything about, my God, not your Egyptian gods, will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Now, Pharaoh is so haunted by these dreams, and he wants an interpretation so badly that he ignores the obvious insult to him and all the Egyptian gods. And he goes ahead and he tells Joseph the dream. And Joseph pauses and then he explains to him what the dream means. He says, you've had a series of dreams that all mean the same thing because God wants to show you these things are going to happen. Okay? This will surely come to pass. He says, Egypt is going to experience 7 years of unprecedented abundance. Okay, Egypt is going to be swimming in grain. But after those 7 years, there's going to be 7 years of famine like no one has ever seen. The skies are going to close up, the rain is going to be gone, and it is going to be awful. So that's the interpretation. 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of famine. And at this point, Joseph should have stopped talking, but it's Joseph. That's not what Joseph does. So he breaks all the sacred royal etiquette, and Joseph begins to give Pharaoh unsolicited advice. At which point, everyone in the room listening to this must have just like moaned, like, what are you doing? What are you doing, young Hebrew man? You're going to get yourself beheaded and impaled. But Joseph just keeps going, and he says, Pharaoh, here's what you should do. Now, no one speaks to Pharaoh like this. He says, here's what you need to do. During the 7 years of abundance, you need to store up grain. Take a percentage of all the grain and hold it in reserve in various cities. Then when the famine comes, the people of Egypt will be able to survive it, and you will be a hero. And Joseph finishes, and the whole room is waiting for Pharaoh to respond. No one speaks to Pharaoh like this Hebrew slave just has. And you have to imagine everyone's like holding their breath. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. And the whole room just exhales. It's like, whew. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Wow. So Joseph gets to work. And we know that he's gifted administratively. He trained in Potiphar's house, though he didn't know he was training. And he trained in the prison, though he didn't know he was training. And now he has the responsibility of saving a nation. And so he organizes this entire huge operation. They identify certain cities, and they build these massive silos, and they store up all this grain. And for 7 years, it is incredible abundance. But then after 7 years, the rain just stops. And it's a drought and a famine like they have never seen. Thankfully, they'd stored up enough grain, and in Egypt, the people survived. But the drought and the famine reached outside the borders of Egypt, reached all the way north to where Joseph's family lived. And they began to feel the effects, and the story continues. It says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, and I think this is kind of funny, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? us. You guys knew there was grain in Egypt? Like I just found out, you knew that? You didn't do anything? We're starving here. So he continued, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Hello. So the boys load up and they head to Egypt. And this is where the stage is set. The fortunes have been reversed. It says, now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger. And so they did not recognize him. And do you know why they didn't recognize him? Because he walked like an Egyptian. Okay, no, I stole that from Andy Stanley, by the way. I wish I could come up with that. They didn't recognize Joseph because he's a 30-year-old Egyptian ruler now. And the last time they saw him, he was a scrawny, terrified teenager. But here they are kneeling in the presence of what feels to them like absolute power. So here is the question that we all have to wrestle with. What do you do? What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of the one who's wounded you? What happens when the script flips? When what goes around comes around? Like, what do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of the one that's wounded you? And the answer to this question will depend on what you've done with your bitterness and what you've done with your anger. If you're still dragging it around, if you're still letting it consume you, if you just feed it by giving it the negative thoughts, then when that day comes, you will be just like the people you don't like. So with his brothers suddenly kneeling before him, you have to imagine all that came flooding back to him in this moment. He was not expecting this. This is a surprise for him. Imagine all that came flooding back. Like the journey to Egypt bound in shackles by slave traders. Like he remembers that journey, the terror of not knowing, the way that he was mistreated by them. He remembers the prayers that he prayed all along the way that went unanswered. He remembers standing eventually on an auction block, stripped naked, people walking all around it, checking him out, trying to determine how much he was worth, trying to determine what he might possibly be used best for. He remembers how things were starting to look up in service to Potiphar. He remembers the lie told by Potiphar's wife, being thrown into a dungeon and then languishing there for years. And now, bowing before him are those who are responsible for all of it. And we don't have time to walk through this. Like, you should read this for yourself if you haven't before. But for the next 3 chapters, he plays with his brothers in this weird, you kind of read it and it's like, what is he doing? What is he up to? And we aren't really told in the story itself, but here's what I think he was doing. I think he was seeing if his brothers would once again abandon a little brother. If they would once again just cast aside their father's favorite out of resentment. He's testing to see if they've changed. And they had. When he threatens to throw Benjamin in the dungeon, they plead with him to take one of them instead. They say, our father, we couldn't. Take one of us instead. Let one of us take his place in prison. And then for Joseph, throughout all this back and forth, it's all very emotional for him, as you can imagine. And what you get the sense of is that he's not really sure what he's going to do. He's like making it up as he goes. Like, what do you do? when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of someone that has deeply wounded you? So they still don't know who he is. And this is all very odd to them. Why is the prime minister of Egypt so concerned with us? And he gets them all in a room with his attendants and his guards, and he does something totally unexpected. And in this moment, the emotion just boils up in him and just kind of spills out. And it says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And suddenly the 10 brothers are alone in the room with this man that holds their destiny, and they can't figure out, why has he singled us out? Why is this really powerful man paying such close attention to us insignificant people? It says, so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And you imagine this moment. There's all this emotion. It's just Joseph in the room and his brothers. And it says, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, like from outside the room. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. And they peedeth their pantseth. That's the old King James anyway. No, that's not in the text. But you have to imagine, right? They're just like, oh, okay, now we see why he's paying so much attention. How? This is just terrifying, right? And so you know that their bladders, releasedeth. Because they're expecting him to do unto them as they had done unto him. And with one word, he holds all the power. 10 stakes in the courtyard, and all of them would be impaled in a single day. That's what awaited them, and they knew it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? And you see just this tender-hearted moment, because he has no idea what's gone on back home. He doesn't know if his father's still alive, and he was dead to them. It says, but his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. What's the right answer to that question? And they too were rehearsing what was said and done to Joseph, and they knew what would surely be awaiting them now that he had the upper hand. And yet it turns out they didn't need to be terrified in his presence, because Joseph had somehow, through all of this mess, learned to live as if God was with him. And despite the horrendous things that happened, he somehow was able to keep the bitterness at bay. So he has them all stand up, and it is a group hug fest, a tear fest. And he sends them home to get his father and all of their families, their kids and their grandkids and the dogs and the cats, right? And he says, I'm gonna send you guys with tons of grain, and I'm going to send you with an armed escort to protect you. Go and get everyone and bring them to Egypt. And here's why. Because I'm going to take care of all of you for the rest of your lives. And so they do. And he does. And they all live in Egypt. And he gives them land, and he gives them grain and everything they need. And years go by, and eventually his father Jacob dies. And now the brothers get a little paranoid. They're like, well, okay, now that dad's gone, maybe Joseph intends to exact vengeance upon us for what we did to him all those years ago. Maybe he was just waiting for dad to die so that dad didn't have to see what he was going to do to all of us. Surely Joseph is going to get even with us now. And so we're told his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. They're like, look, we sold you into slavery, and if you'll spare our lives, if you will somehow spare our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives, all the lives of our people, we will be your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. There's no doubt about that. You guys are guilty. You intended to harm me. He says, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So Joseph looks back on all of this mess of his life with incredible perspective. And he says, God was with me in all of it. He was with me in all of it. And he's led me through it all. And now here I am, able to save all of Egypt. And even more, I'm able to save all of you. Through all of it, my brothers, God never left me. I didn't see it and I didn't know it at the time, but he was up to something beautiful. And look, would you just look at what God has done? So then, don't be afraid, he says. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them again. And he spoke kindly to them. Here's the thing. One day you might have power over the person or the persons who took from you, who harmed you, who wounded you, who took that first marriage, who stole your childhood, who stole your chance to raise your own children. And in those moments, you'll remember what they did to you. You'll remember what it was that they took from you. And in that moment, your heavenly Father is going to invite you to remember something else as well. He's going to ask you to remember who it was that was with you. And in that moment, you'll have a decision to make. What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of the one that's wounded you? Will you pay them back? You could. Or will you use those words to pave the way forward? This is God's dream. This is God's dream, that our hearts would eventually be yielded to him. And we know the phrases, we say this all the time in our culture, right? We know that hurt people often hurt people. And we know that bullied people often bully people. And we know that abandoned sons often become absent fathers. And we know that wounded daughters often become neglectful mothers. But here's God's dream, that healed people, the whole opposite of this, that healed people would heal people. That forgiven people would forgive people. That his beloved would turn in love with reckless abandon. And so if you know his love or you know his grace or you have experienced his presence, then when the hard times come, he's inviting you to do the really hard thing. To forgive and to love and to heal just like him. And we do this because this is the way of the one that we follow. It's the way of the one who prayed on that gruesome day when he was mistreated and misunderstood. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He's our King. And we're his servants. And we do his bidding, which means that we heal and we forgive. And we do our best to love with our whole hearts. And we do that by focusing on the one who was with us, not the ones who abandoned us. And if we can do that, we will somehow become like the one who gave everything for us. And we will be set free. Now, this is kind of heavy. I mean, for some of you that are in the thick of this, this is heavy. For some of you, you're not in the thick of this, right? And you're like, okay, well, that was an interesting sermon. I'll log that one away. Interesting story today. I like the walk like an Egyptian thing. You know, for others of you, you're like, this isn't just some interesting, you are right in the thick of it. And suddenly you actually do have power over somebody who has wounded you. And you didn't necessarily see that change coming, but here it is. It's very real, and now you're right in the middle of it. And for others of you, you can't honestly imagine ever having power over those that have hurt you. But I'm just telling you, I'm just here to say, you never know. Life has this amazing way of taking unexpected turns. And if that happens, what you do in those moments will say so much about who you are. And it will say so much about the person that you've become.